Welcome to the Beyond Atheism podcast, with me, Nathan Alexander, and my co-host, Todd Tavares. This podcast moves beyond questions of God's existence to ask, what's next in a godless world? If you're enjoying the show so far, remember to like and subscribe, rate and review, and consider supporting us on Patreon. Beyond Atheism is produced and distributed by Atheist United Studios.
Today, we examine another piece in the history of free thought, its intellectual sources, and how this history is often obscured by cultural norms that promote the idea that Christianity is natural in American cultures. In particular, we'll focus on how the African American experience shaped the varieties of Black freethinking, and how Black free thought, in turn, informed the liberation movements of the 60s and 70s. Here with us today is Dr. Christopher Cameron. He's a professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. He's the founder of African American Intellectual History Society, and most recently the author of Black Freethinkers, A History of African American Secularism. Chris, welcome to Beyond Atheism.
Hey, thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, Chris. Really looking forward to talking with you. So just to get started, can you tell us about your religious background? Were you raised religious or what?
Kind of. So at times I was raised religious. I think it was when my mom was feeling guilty for not taking us to church enough. So my mom was French Canadian. She was Quebecois. Her and her siblings and all of them had migrated down to New Hampshire in the early 60s. So for them, being French Canadian kind of meant, going to midnight mass on Christmas Eve and going to church on Easter. My grandmother was a little more religious. She was involved with like the Daughters of Isabella and, my grandfather, the Knights of Columbus and stuff. But my mom really wasn't super into it. That being said, there would be times, my mom was a white French Canadian. She married two different Black men. And so there would be times where she would sort of take us to like Black holiness churches or, evangelical churches or something like that. And we'd go for like a month and a half. She'd be like real into it and then just basically fall off,
Mm-hmm.
So I got a lot of exposure to different religions. I even went to Catholic school for 2 years in high school in Connecticut, and we sort of had to go to church there every Sunday. So I got a lot of exposure to a lot of religions, but I wasn't sort of super religious at all until actually I got locked up when I was 17 years old and spent 8 months in jail. And I had this sort of dramatic jailhouse conversion experience, and I was sort of born again and everything. But that fell off pretty quickly after I got out of jail.
Right.
And I substituted sort of religion for like Narcotics Anonymous and Alcoholics Anonymous, because I had to go to those as part of my probation, and those are like very religious. So that kind of became sort of like a church. But again, it was forced. It wasn't like I would have never have gone to those if I wasn't on probation. So I did that for a couple of years till I got off of probation, and religion just sort of fell off for me for a while. But I got back into it in grad school when I was 26 years old. I moved from New Hampshire, or sorry, like 23. I moved from New Hampshire down to Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and I was just sort of searching for community and connection. There weren't a lot of other Black graduate students in my program. And so I was also looking to kind of connect to the local Black community. So I joined St. Paul's African Methodist Episcopal Church in Chapel Hill. This was in like the fall of 2006. And I went pretty regularly. I was really into it for a good 8 or 9 months. I was going to Bible study, doing all of that. But it just never really felt authentic to me. It never felt like it was me. I even got baptized and everything, but I'd be sitting there in the church services and they're like, all right, stand now, sit now, say this prayer. And I don't know, it just all felt fake and contrived. So I started going to the Quaker meeting in Chapel Hill. And I actually liked that quite a bit because there weren't all these like to me, seemingly useless rituals. It was like you go there, you sit in silence, at least for 10 minutes. And if the quote unquote inner light, pushes you to speak, you speak. But there would be times where we would sit in silent meditation for the entire church service. So the Quaker meeting was kind of like my halfway house towards atheism, right? That was sort of like moving out of more traditional religion. At the same time as I was going to that, I started getting into philosophers like Jiddu Krishnamurti, who's highly critical of organized religion. And then once I encountered the works of New Atheists, Dawkins and Harris and Daniel Dennett and some of them, that pretty much did it for me. So I had probably a grand total of like 2 years of my life before turning 26, 27, where I was pretty religious. But aside from that, I was either indifferent to it or after that, openly hostile.
Wow.
Right.
So the lesson I drew from it is the things that'll drive you to religion are prison and grad school.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
But for this most recent project, what was the impetus behind it? What led you to this? Why did you decide to study Black atheists and free thinking?
Yeah, I came across this project sort of by accident, but it was, at that point, this was probably about 2012 or so. I was already an ardent atheist. And I was kind of searching for connection in the free thought community now, right? And trying to find other free thinkers, especially Black atheists and agnostics, right? And so I started like connecting with folks online and, coming across websites and blogs and stuff like that. And I started like just finding tidbits of information about historical Black atheists. And I was already finishing up my first book project on African-American abolitionists. I was looking for another project. And so I just kind of sort of stumbled on this, right? Like I would read some of these blog posts and, they'd be interesting, but from a historian's perspective, I wanted to know a lot more. And so I kind of started searching for the historiography of Black atheists and agnostics. And I found that was pretty much non-existent. So that's sort of how I got into it. And I just wanted to know more about people like me, in part, but I was also looking for another scholarly research project. So this was, for me, something that really gave me the opportunity to combine like the personal and the academic, in a way that I thought would really kind of drive me and push me to write a good book and to write it quickly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thanks. Yeah. Thanks for that. I mean, yeah, it's such a fascinating story how you've had so many different religious kind of and irreligious experiences. Really fascinating. So I guess just to sort of begin at the start. Well, what do we know about the religion of enslaved people? Well, I guess we can ask what did they bring over with them from Africa? And yeah, well, yeah, just yeah. I'll just leave it there for now.
This has been a huge debate in the historiography dating back at least to the 1940s, if not a little earlier, with the work of scholars like Melville Herskovitz, The Myth of the Negro Past. And some scholars have argued, some scholars have argued that there was something akin to an African spiritual holocaust, right, where basically Africans were so traumatized by the experience of the Middle Passage that they kind of lost their culture, right, and that they lost their history. And others have argued that, Black culture in the Americas was heavily influenced by African cultures, right? So, I think we do know, I kind of tend more towards this latter school that, African cultures and spiritualities were not lost, right? A lot of those were just reshaped and repurposed in the New World to create new religions like, Obeah in Jamaica, or Santeria, Voodoo, Conjure, all of that. One influential book for me was Daniel Fountain's Slavery and Salvation, where he kind of goes through and does a pretty systematic analysis of African American religion leading up to the Civil War, and argues that while many scholars have claimed that Christianity was sort of predominant in the slave community, that actually wasn't the case. He's found a lot more influence of African religions than Christianity. And he argues that the majority of enslaved people were not Christians prior to the Civil War, but practiced some form of African spirituality, right? So, Africans brought their religion over with them. The response of slave masters was mixed to this. Some wanted to completely ban African religions and convert their slaves to Christianity. Some wanted to ban African religions, but not really replace it with anything, because they were afraid of their slaves learning the sort of liberatory messages of Christianity, right? Moses and Jesus, all that. So there were really different approaches, but what I found is, by and large, I don't know if I would say most, but a significant amount of masters were either indifferent or hostile to their slaves learning Christianity. And for those who did allow their slaves to become Christians and did advocate for that, it was a very restricted and particular type of Christianity that was meant to sort of reinforce the forced labor regime, right? Don't steal, don't lie, things like that. It wasn't about individual regeneration or becoming necessarily a better person, but it was about not taking the master's stuff.
So the state of like slave religion, we can't even talk about it as one unified thing. That it just wasn't that case at all.
Yeah, no, absolutely not, because these people are coming from all types of, all different regions in West Africa, some from East Africa, right? So they practiced different religions before they even got here. And then, some are going to Portuguese colonies, others are going to Spanish, right? Some are going to English. So you've got, various versions of Protestantism that they're being exposed to, different versions of Catholicism. So even throughout the diaspora, there were just, so many different religious beliefs. It's hard to kind of group it under the term slave religion, although that is kind of a commonly used term.
Yeah, but it's all over the place. It's not one thing at all.
Exactly. And that sort of diversity of African American religions is partially what led me to think, well, if there are so many different religious beliefs, there are probably also some non-religious or irreligious beliefs, right? Because as long as people have been saying there's a God, there's been people who have said, no, I don't think so.
Yeah. And I mean, do we find that in the sort of like antebellum period, or does this become more noticeable and recognized only during Reconstruction after the war?
No, we definitely have evidence during the antebellum period, largely from slave narratives and accounts of travelers to the South who sort of witnessed the religion of enslaved people, right? So now the thing about the slave narratives, though, is these are being produced for a very particular purpose, to arouse sympathy towards enslaved people, largely among a white population. So it really wouldn't behoove an author of a slave narrative to come out and say, slavery made me an atheist. But what you do see is a lot of kind of circumstantial evidence for the existence of atheism, right? And this is a theme that comes up again and again. A master gave a slave a brutal whipping, right? And that person started to doubt God. A slave ran away and then a master cut off a limb or something, and that made them doubt God, right? Like this comes up again and again, and these slave narratives kind of show that the brutal conditions of slavery, physical assault, sexual assault, separation from family members, hunger, thirst, all of that. This pushed many enslaved people to doubt that there was a God looking out for them, right? And you see some of the same things from the travel accounts of enslaved people too. There are one or two instances where slaves do talk about their own religious skepticism. So William Wells Brown is sort of one example. Frederick Douglass is another. But by and large, they're sort of talking about the presence of atheism and religious skepticism in slave communities.
Yeah, Todd and I were just talking about earlier, just before you came on. Well, on the one hand, there could be things that would push someone into atheism and disbelief, but then there's also, I guess, sort of like liberatory themes in the Bible that would push someone towards that. So there's sort of that interesting kind of interplay, I suppose, between how the experience of enslavement might affect someone's religious views.
Yeah, and we kind of see that all throughout American history, right? That some of the same conditions can foster ardent religious belief or deep religious skepticism, right? For some people, being forced to go to church is what introduces them to religion, and they come to love the music and they love the theology, and they're born again and they're lifelong church members. For others, being forced to go to church is a serious imposition on their freedom and autonomy, and they come to resent it, and that pushes them towards atheism, right? So so it's kind of strange like that some of the same conditions can foster very different outcomes.
But then, I mean, there's a big upheaval that really changes the circumstances through the outcome of the Civil War, through Reconstruction. So now, like, all of society is completely changed. Well, the formal legal slavery is finished.
Yeah. Right.
You have this period of Reconstruction. How does the change in circumstances, how does this change in society change what we see in Black free thought at the time and how it develops?
Yeah, so the period of Reconstruction is actually sort of a low point for Black free thought, right? So I found much more evidence of Black religious skepticism and atheism during the antebellum period than I did during Reconstruction. And I think that's in part because during Reconstruction, African Americans no longer have to go to white churches and hear the religious messages that they were hearing before, some of those messages that drove them away from religion, right? Pro-slavery religion, all that. Now they can start their own churches, the AME Church, the AME Zion Church, Baptist churches. So there's a great sort of flowering of Black religious life in the Reconstruction era that I think really pulled in a lot of African Americans. And these churches were also kind of social, educational, and political institutions as well, right? They were sort of the center of Black life. So it would be really hard for African Americans to kind of reject religious life if they wanted other things, right? If they wanted to go to school or get a good job or something like that. So this is something of a low point. But that being said, we do have some evidence of some prominent Black freethinkers arising during this time, or some folks from the antebellum period who are getting more involved in the formal free thought movement. Like Frederick Douglass, for example, wasn't necessarily involved in the free thought movement prior to the Civil War. But after the Civil War, he would become one of the vice presidents of the Free Religious Association. This was sort of a secular, kind of like a secular church almost, created by transcendentalists in Massachusetts in the late 1860s to promote sort of a religion of humanity, kind of a precursor to the humanism that would arise in the 20th century. So he was pretty involved in that. Actually, for the project I'm working on now, I was just reading about a woman named Maria Baldwin, who I absolutely would have included in chapter 1 of Black Freethinkers. Maria Baldwin was a Black woman who became a principal of an all-white school in Cambridge, Massachusetts during the 1880s. She was also a member of the Free Religious Association, and she was involved in the Ethical Society of Boston. I had no clue about her, but the biography of her was published probably 5 or 6 years ago, so I should have known about her. But I'll write about her in my next book. But then you have other figures like David Sinclair, who became a really well-known Black atheist speaker. He was a former preacher who sort of kind of switched gears and became, a free thought evangelical, if you will, and started kind of traveling around and trying to convert Black people to atheism. So, there were certainly some people here and there. Nothing of a kind of organized Black free thought movement or anything like that, or even really particularly large communities of Black freethinkers, but more individuals who are placed in kind of select locations that could do their work and also work in tandem with some white freethinkers, which we see a very opposite trajectory for white free thought during this period. This is really kind of what Susan Jacoby calls the golden age of free thought, right? This period from 1875 up till World War I, where you have this great flowering of secular organizations and periodicals and the like.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that, I guess you could say there is more of a flourishing of African American free thought during the Harlem Renaissance. And maybe you can tell us, what is the Harlem Renaissance and what happened there?
Yeah, sure. So the Harlem Renaissance, also probably more accurately known now as the New Negro Renaissance, because scholars are pointing out that some of these trends were present in Chicago, New Orleans, Paris, right, London. So this was sort of a diasporic phenomenon, but it was really a literary and intellectual movement that kind of highlighted Black culture, right? That showed an appreciation for Black culture, and it was a flowering of, or a kind of a widespread movement that saw the production and publication of lots of poems and plays and novels and the like. Started right after World War I in Harlem and other cities like Chicago and Detroit. And lasted up through the mid to late 1930s. And this was really significant for a number of different reasons. One, African American culture was sort of in vogue during this time period, and Black writers and artists had a lot of white patrons and financial support for their work. And this work oftentimes criticize religion, right? And which isn't surprising among, artists and intellectuals and folks like that. But it was also important just on a kind of demographic level, right? So, a lot of Black atheists grew up in smaller kind of rural Black communities in the South, or the Midwest, right? Communities where they couldn't exactly be open about their critiques of religion, right? So some of them, people like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, their autobiographies indicate that they became religious skeptics at a very young age. And Hurston even writes in her autobiography, Dust Tracks on a Road, that I began questioning, her father's sermons. Her father was a preacher. Began questioning all these ideas at a very young age, but I never said anything because I thought I would be sort of ostracized by my community. But with the Great Migration to northern cities, which occurred between 1915 and 1930, saw approximately 1.5 million Black Southerners migrate to the urban north. Now, these people who might have been the kind of sole Black freethinker in their community, now they're around other kind of like-minded people, right? Who they could share ideas with, they could read some of their works, refine their ideas, gather together on Sundays when most Black people are going to church, and they could discuss politics and critique religion and all of that. So it was really important. It was a really important moment in, one, the publication opportunities it opened up, right? And you would see in the poems of Langston Hughes and the novels of people like Nella Larson and Zora Neale Hurston, you would see a lot of this kind of cultural production would be highly critical of religion, but it was also really significant in sort of fostering a Black secular community.
Mm. So it sounds like this is where the legacy really builds from. That this is, if we go back, this is where the root is. What did they draw on themselves? Did they draw from earlier, from like the Reconstruction, Black free thought, or were they creating it whole cloth just based on their experiences?
So both, as well as drawing from white free thought, right? So some of these Black free thinkers in the Harlem Renaissance era were reading the older works of people like Frederick Douglass, right? And other kind of critics of religion in the 19th century. They were also drawing from just their own lived experience living in a white supremacist and segregated society, one that was becoming increasingly more segregated and seeing increasing levels of racial violence and hostility with the revival of the Ku Klux Klan after 1914, race riots all across the country during the infamous Red Summer of 1919. So their lived experience also played a role, but this was a moment, the 19 teens and 20s, where we see white free thought heavily influencing Black free thinkers, right? Not in some respects, kind of contemporary white free thinkers and relationships with them, but also reading the works of historical white free thinkers, especially Thomas Paine, right? So engaging with somebody like Thomas Paine was really highly influential. Reading the lectures of Robert Ingersoll was also another sort of big source of Black free thought. Harry Haywood, a really prominent Black freethinker and Black communist, talks about encountering some of the lectures of Ingersoll and that sort of turning him towards atheism. So it's those kind of all three of those factors, right? A little bit of engagement with Black freethinkers, probably more engagement with white freethinkers, and also, like enslaved people did, kind of drawing off of their own lived experiences and just kind of reasoning their way to atheism.
And now, was their legacy something that built quickly in terms of free thought and a move away from Christianity, or is this something that was only seen sort of looking back from the civil rights movement?
I definitely think it built pretty quickly. So really within the span of probably 15 to 20 years, you have this just great outpouring of Black free thought writing and Black free thought organizing during this era, right? I dedicate 2 chapters of the book to this period, right? To the Harlem Renaissance and also to kind of political organizing during this time period. So it's something that really took off very quickly. It started to have kind of a publication home with works like The Messenger magazine that A. Philip Randolph and Chandler Owen published. Also had something of an institutional home in the Harlem Unitarian Church, started by Egbert Ethelred Brown in 1920. Now, Brown was a black, he was a Jamaican Unitarian minister, and he himself was a theist, but very sort of liberal in his religious beliefs. He thought that religion had to be useful to humanity, right? Anything that wasn't needed to be discarded. And he also used his church as sort of a forum for discussing atheism and secularism, right? He would have debates in the church with a black freethinker and a white minister in New York on the question of whether or not there's a God or is religion useful, right? So he really provided a space for the flowering of black free thought. And indeed, in 1928, upon the death of Hubert Harrison, the Harlem Unitarian Church was renamed the Hubert H. Harrison Memorial Church. And Harrison was probably, the most outspoken black freethinker of this time period. So to name the church after him shows the extent to which, they kind of valued his ideas and just his place in the Harlem community. He was really a towering black intellectual.
Yeah, this is just fascinating. I mean, I feel like we're just barely sort of scratching the surface here. We should nonetheless jump ahead a couple of decades. I think another turning point, I guess, is the 60s, the civil rights movement. And, well, I think in the popular imagination, it's very much seen as kind of like a very religiously driven movement. But is that true?
So yes, it is true. So the civil rights movement was a religiously driven movement. Religious figures were at the sort of head of the movement. What I argue in Black Freethinkers, though, is that that's not the only truth, right? Just because that's true doesn't mean that secularism and atheism wasn't also important, right? And that's the thing that most scholars of the civil rights movement have pretty much ignored. So yes, religion was very prominent. Churches were, critical meeting places for black activists all throughout the nation. And so all of that was there, but we've ignored the sort of secular motivations of many of the activists in the civil rights movement, right? We just basically haven't really talked about it. So James Foreman is somebody who was very prominent in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He was a key figure in the sort of transition to Black Power and a member of the Black Panther Party. And so he's somebody that would show up in, many, if not most, histories of the civil rights movement, but people don't really talk or write about his motivations for getting involved in politics in the first place. And if you read his autobiography, The Making of Black Revolutionaries, it's very clear. He states very clearly that he believes atheism, or he believes religion has hurt his people. And he says that his atheism is what sort of pushed him to become involved in politics, right? Because as an atheist, he felt that it was his responsibility to improve the lives of African Americans in the United States, right? The same thing is true of figures like Stokely Carmichael, who became an atheist and a communist while he was attending the Bronx High School of Science in the 1950s. Carmichael would be an atheist for most of his life, and he also writes about in his autobiography how his atheism sort of motivated his political activity, made him sort of feel a responsibility to get involved in politics. So while the civil rights movement was heavily influenced by religion, that's not the only story, right? And so I'm trying to tell a more complex story that recognizes the importance of religion, but also shows that, there are a number of figures from James Foreman to Carmichael to James Baldwin, Huey Newton, Lorraine Hansberry, and others who were much more motivated by secularism and atheism than religion.
Is that true in the Black Power movement? So if we focus more on people like the Panthers, did they have these sort of, did they have religious positions? Do we find that legacy there as well?
Yeah, among the leaders of the Black Panthers, especially Huey Newton, Eldridge Cleaver, people like Yvette Pearson, Sarah Webster Fabio, and others. Many of the leaders at the national level and even leaders of local branches like Lumumba Shakur, leader of the Black Panther Party in New York City. Many of them were highly critical of religion. They were critical of the sort of nonviolent and pacifist approach of the religious wing of the civil rights movement. They were advocates of self-defense, right? Armed self-defense. And also, there's during the 1960s with Lyndon Johnson's political reforms and all that, a lot of money was flowing to urban communities for different social service projects and the like. And a lot of this money would actually flow to churches or to nonprofits that were headed by ministers. And so you would see Black Panthers who were highly critical of the sort of control that Black ministers had over these funds from the federal government, right? So that was another kind of thing playing a role in their opposition to organized religion. So they were opposed to, the theology and the sort of pacifist elements of Christianity, but also the practical sort of on the ground effects of religious organizations in their communities. They thought they were having a detriment, that this money was not reaching the people, that it was just enriching the pockets
Right.
of ministers.
And yeah, and sort of on that point, I mean, thinking about the relationship between politics and free thought or atheism, do you think it's atheism driving the politics or politics driving the atheism? How do you see that kind of relationship?
Yeah, it's really symbiotic. At times, it's both. I think, so often scholars of African American politics discuss the importance of religion, right? Including the prominence of ministers and churches in Black political life, the use of religious discourse in Black political thought, and faith in God motivating people to organize politically. I argue that the opposite was also true, right? Skepticism and irreligion motivated certain types of political behavior and informed certain political ideologies. This was especially true of the Black socialists and communists that I discuss in chapter 3 of the book. People like Hubert Harrison, Louise Thompson Patterson, and Harry Haywood, who explicitly tied their political and economic critique of capitalism to religion, right? So for them, religion and capitalism were working hand in hand to oppress Black people throughout the world, to sort of reinforce the color line. So for these individuals, free thought kind of pushed them towards socialism and communism. But also the reverse was true, right? Because in 1926, for example, the Communist International put out a directive that they expect all worldwide communists to be atheists, right? And if you became a communist, you basically were forbidden from participating in formal or organized religion, even liberal religion, right? So some Black atheists and communists who were going to the Harlem Unitarian Church in New York City, the Communist Party was like, "Why are you going to that church? We don't really do that." So some people were first kind of drawn to communism, and then that sort of pushed them towards atheism, right? But I think more often it was kind of the other way around, that they became religious skeptics first, and that then made a political movement that was critical of religion more attractive to them.
It sounds like the politics were also pretty variable between sort of liberal civil rights and radical communism. There's a pretty broad spectrum there
Yeah,
on
yeah,
the left throughout that
absolutely.
time. Were there things that you can identify as commonalities between this sort of black atheism, black free thought, and political objectives or political positions?
So throughout my research, I found that generally speaking, not always, but generally speaking, African American radical political thinkers tended to be free thinkers also, right? And it's that critique of authority, right? That sort of radical individualism that developed in free thought circles also extended to political circles, right? Because free thinkers are famous for not really holding any punches and being very, very outspoken and very critical and really kind of going against the norms of their society in terms of religion. And that often kind of translated into politics, but not always, right? We have figures like Frederick Douglass, who was not particularly radical, right? In fact, held numerous government positions. He was much more liberal, arguing for a multiracial, multicultural society, and this was reflected in his own life, in marrying a white woman after his first wife passed away. So, or somebody like Zora Neale Hurston, who sort of drifted towards political conservatism actually in the 1940s. At a time when most Black people were starting to move to the Democratic Party, she became more of an outspoken Republican, right? So it doesn't, it's not that free thought necessarily leads to radicalism, but I think oftentimes it has.
Yeah. Well, to shift gears a little bit, I guess, looking more broadly at the history kind of in the long view. But one of the sort of themes we've seen in some of the other episodes where we've talked about the history of free thought is this kind of idea of like discontinuities and connections sometimes, and other times people are kind of making things up on their own, maybe reinventing the wheel. And I think you've already kind of touched upon this, that Black Freethinkers in the Harlem Renaissance, for example, were drawing on white free thought. But looking at Black free thought in general, do you think we should talk about kind of Black free thought and white free thought kind of developing in parallel, or was there enough sort of connections that we can sort of see them as kind of more of a singular movement?
Yeah. So, at their heart, Black and white free thought are both about skepticism about the existence of God, or denying the existence of God, or saying we can't really know. That's true among both of them, right? Um,
Well, I mean, are they unified? Are either of these actually like one train of
Well, that's
thought?
another thing. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's another
yeah,
thing.
Yeah.
that's the thing. I mean, even within white free thought and Black free thought, you have a lot of kind of divergences, right? But that's sort of a commonality, right? If we're looking at white atheists and Black atheists, they both don't believe in God. But
Yeah.
the emergence of that belief and the foundations of that belief certainly developed along different lines, right, in the antebellum period. So um, for deists and theophilanthropists and other white freethinkers, and from the Revolution up to the Civil War, a lot of their sort of secularism was grounded in Enlightenment philosophy, or like me, kind of grew out of religious liberalism, right? Whereas that wasn't really the case for Black freethinkers, right? Especially in the antebellum period, their religious skepticism grew much more from their lived experience, in large part because they just didn't have access to to books and treatises, pamphlets, all that type of stuff that would let them read Paine or Voltaire or, any of these philosophers. So in terms of the origins, they developed very separately. And then, the existence and prominence of white supremacy kind of guaranteed that they would sort of remain separate, throughout the 19th and the 20th centuries. So even while Black atheists during the Harlem Renaissance were coming to their positions by reading white freethinkers, they weren't coming to those positions for the most part by engaging with white freethinkers in their own time, right? Because oftentimes some of these white freethinkers were virulent racists and would not have welcomed them to their meetings, right? Hubert Harrison is an exception to this. He was, prominent in New York City's free thought scene, and would interact and socialize with white freethinkers and white socialists in New York City. But for the most part, they kind of developed along very separate tracks. And one of the things that's really distinctive about Black free thought is a commitment to liberation for Black people and the fight against white supremacy. And that's sort of a very kind of prominent feature within most, if not all, Black free thought writing, right? Even though they might approach that political commitment through different means, right? Or through different strategies. That sort of commitment to challenging white supremacy, as you can imagine, was not very prominent in the white free thought movement. Although there were of course some exceptions to this rule.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
that makes too much sense.
Yeah. Before we wrap up, I thought, Chris, maybe you could tell us if you have any recommendations for maybe if people are going to read 3 books by a Black free thought author, which books would you recommend people read?
Sure. So aside from mine,
yes, obviously, yes.
Aside from mine, I'd recommend first Sakivu Hutchinson's book, Moral Combat: Black Atheist Gender Politics and the Values Wars. This is more about the sort of contemporary free thought movement, and especially the kind of place of Black women within that movement, and the fact that, within African American communities, it's actually much more acceptable for Black men to be atheists or agnostics than it is for Black women, right? Black women carry this like special burden of passing on the religious traditions of the community to their children, right? So they're oftentimes ostracized to a much greater extent than Black men are for their free thought. So I'd also recommend Anthony B. Pinn's book, The End of God Talk: An African American Humanist Theology. This book was really influential for me as I started working on Black freethinkers. His goal, it's also kind of aimed towards a contemporary secular movement, and he's trying to build a sort of
recent book.
Yeah, I think he published it recent to me, but he published it in like 2014. I consider anything this century as recent to me.
Yes.
Historiographically speaking. But he's basically using African American secular history to build a contemporary sort of Black secular humanist theology, right? And he's saying, one of the major arguments throughout his body of work is that theology does not need to be about God, right? It can be about sort of an orientation to life and something that kind of helps you move through this world, right? So for an African American humanist, a museum or a coffee shop can be just as sacred a space as a church, right? Or some religious, memorial or something like that. instead of the Bible, we could read Frederick Douglass, or we could read Toni Morrison, right? We can read that and get the same thing that religious people get out of reading their texts. And then The Fire Next Time. This was a key text for me when I was writing the chapter on the civil rights movement, The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin. And here he sort of goes into the sort of racial politics of his era, but also discusses some of his own religious background and his critiques of organized religion. And it's really kind of emblematic of a lot of the themes that you see sort of throughout Black free thought history.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great. So yeah, we'll include links to those books down below so people can check them out.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And I think we should move on to Can a True Atheist? This is the lightning round. Nathan, could you explain how it works?
Yes. So we're going to ask you, Chris, some questions. Just tongue-in-cheek questions, really, about can a true atheist do such and such? Can a true atheist say, "Oh my God," for example? And so you can give a little bit of explanation, but mostly short answers.
Yeah, it can be normative. It can be like what you think they ought to do. It can be factual.
Interpretation is up to you. Yes. So for the kind of baseline question, can a true atheist believe in God?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, that's easy. Okay. So the next one, can a true atheist believe with 100% certainty that there is no God?
Yes.
Oh, wow.
Okay.
I don't think an agnostic can, but I think if you're atheist, you believe there's no God.
Right.
With 100% certainty.
Look at this. Finally, someone playing the game right. With certainty, Nathan.
Yes.
No waffling, no hemming and hewing, and none of that.
Yes. All right. Can a true atheist go to church?
Yes, I go to church. Usually Unitarian.
Okay, right.
Occasionally, I'll go to a black church. It's just kind of a cultural thing, hear some black music, dress up.
Right.
Just be around the people. But you can go to church, sure.
Right.
Wow. Can a true atheist walk over someone's grave in a cemetery?
Yes.
Wow. Have you done that?
I haven't, but I don't think my atheism would prevent me from doing so.
All right. Okay. Can a true atheist be racist?
Yes, definitely.
Okay.
Lots of those out there.
Right. Okay.
Should they though?
They should not. I would think that your atheism fosters a certain level of critical thought that would help to fight atheism within yourself and your belief system, but that's oftentimes not the case.
Is this something that comes up? I'm assuming it does come up in black atheist writings, that there are arguments against racism.
Mm-hmm.
As you mentioned, that's not part of that's not part of what Robert Ingersoll is trying to do. It's not part of the White Project.
Yeah.
So, what if you can distill it? What's the argument? What's the atheist argument against racism?
The black atheist argument against racism is, how do I distill this very quickly for a lightning round?
This probably should have come up earlier.
Yeah.
It's more not necessarily against racism, but against kind of racists. Well, I think also it is also against racism, right? So it's that the presence and the virulence of racism in American society is evidence that there is not a benevolent and just and loving God looking out for black people, right? I think that's the kind of persistent claim that you see in black atheist writings, right? How can there be a loving God when we see all of this racism?
Makes sense. I'm convinced. So I guess it's back to me.
Yeah.
Can a true atheist say thank you if someone says they're praying for you?
Yes. Yeah, certainly. And I do that. Just, you know, I'm married to a black woman, so my in-laws are African American, although my family is white, the family that I know. Um, so yeah, that's pretty common in black culture to just say you're praying for somebody, and it kind of offends me at some points, but I don't really let that be visible, right? Because a lot of times I just don't really want to get into it.
Yeah.
Yes.
um and it's like, if all you're doing is saying that you'll pray for me, or thanking the Lord for something that I just did for you, which is really annoying. But
Yes.
I'm right here.
I make a pot of coffee, and you see the coffee and say, thank God. It's like, actually, thank Chris.
Yes.
So they're annoying, but is it really worth alienating somebody and getting into a 30-minute
Yeah.
argument
Yeah,
over
that's
that?
fair, yeah.
I
Yeah.
just say, oh, thanks.
Yeah.
Yes,
You mean
yeah.
well.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's the thing. Can a true atheist swear an oath?
Yeah, because we don't believe that there's going to be any repercussions
Right,
to
okay.
lying about the oath.
Right.
So, yeah,
Right,
sure.
okay.
Great
Right.
point. Yeah. Can a true atheist tell kids that Santa will bring them presents?
Yeah, and that's again a thing of keeping the peace, right?
Yeah.
So, my wife would be very, very mad if I said Santa doesn't exist, and neither does all these imaginary things that people are telling you.
Right.
So,
Yep.
yeah, I go along to get along. Some people
Okay.
aren't like that.
That's
yeah.
also it's sweet. It's a sweet thing to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My kid just lost her first tooth, and we said that the
okay.
tooth fairy put the $5 under her pillow.
Right.
And again, she's thanking the tooth fairy.
Yes, right.
And you're right there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Can a true atheist, if they were raised religious, can they miss some things about being a believer?
Yeah, I think so. I actually just wrote a piece on this for Only Sky.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, this publication just started. So the piece was what I do and don't miss about religion.
Oh,
And
perfect. All right.
so it was different people just kind of reflecting on that question. And so I wrote a bit about, going to the AME Church in Chapel Hill. And while there were a lot of things that felt kind of disingenuous to me about the religious practice, I do miss going out to brunch with a bunch of educated Black people afterwards, right? Lawyers, doctors, fellow graduate students, all of that. Just the kind of sense of community, not even the sense of community, the actual community
yes,
that we built there. So yeah, I kind of miss that. And then, if you're not very intentional about it, it's easy to go through your life and not really kind of think deeply about how to become a better person, right? You're going through, you're raising your kids, you're working, you know what I mean? It's easy not to take that time to sort of reflect on where you are morally, ethically, whatever, and how you might improve. And church kind of gives you that 1 hour, or in a Black church, 2 to 3 hours. It gives you that space every week to kind of reflect on who you are and kind of where you want to go. So I do miss that a little bit, but there are obviously ways to kind of incorporate that into your life. So
yeah. Also, that sounds like a very different church than what I was raised with, where I was just being told about how I was going to hell and how I was a sinner.
Yeah,
And
there was definitely that too.
Yeah. All right. So the next question was going to be vandalize a church, but I'm going to have to tone it down after that answer. So can a true atheist attend a church, pass gas, and then deny it?
Yes. I'm going to say yes.
All right. That sounds fair.
That is
Chris,
definitely toning it down,
yeah. Chris, this was a fantastic talk. I learned a lot. I'm really glad you came on. This was fantastic.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this.
Yeah. Yeah.
So for you, what comes next in terms of projects?
Working on my book on African American Unitarian Universalists. So that's in some respects kind of similar to Black Freethinkers. It goes from the colonial period up through the civil rights era, and just looks at the sort of place of blacks within Universalist and Unitarian churches, while they were kind of separate denominations. Their kind of critical importance at key moments, particularly the founding of some of the first Universalist churches in the United States, their role in the Transcendentalist movement of the 1830s and 1840s, and then kind of turning in the later 19th century to the founding of some of the first Black Universalist and Unitarian churches in the United States, and then kind of ending in the Civil Rights era, looking at the creation of the Black Unitarian Universalist Caucus, which was sort of a common development in Protestant denominations across the nation, right? Black people arguing for self-determination within these churches, but not wanting to leave, right? So in the UU context, people who are really devoted to liberal theology, but just wanted more control and more power within the denomination. So sort of formed this movement to try to get that, and also were active in the Black Power movement and the Civil Rights movement. So yeah, I'm working on that right now, and then that's sort of a more scholarly book. So I'll publish that with UMass Press, and then next year I'm going to be working on a book for a secular press in Durham, North Carolina. That Anthony Pinn edits this series. So that's going to be a book called 7 Facts About the History of Humanism. So basically be sort of 7 chapters taking us through humanism in the United States. So humanism more broadly, so won't just focus on sort of Black humanists. That'll be kind of a shorter project, 50,000 words or so, aimed at a more general audience of free thinkers.
Right. So yeah, people should definitely look out for those books and check out Chris's Black Freethinkers as well.
Yep, linked below.
Yeah. Yes. All right. Well, thanks again, Chris. The time has completely flown by.
Yeah, thank
Yeah.
you again. This has been great.
Okay, that was Dr. Christopher Cameron. Really fascinating conversation. Todd, what did you make of that?
I kind of love these episodes. I love it when we get into the history and the culture and exploring like these commonalities of atheism, right? Like, I mean, the history of free thought. How is it connected to the free thought of today? What's the lineage, the intellectual lineage of atheist thinking? What's the genealogy of it? I guess not so secretly, I really love it, even though it's not moving in the way we like to think beyond atheism, right? But it is, because we're building this. We get to decide what's in it and what's not, right? Like when you become an atheist, look, I'm Catholic. I was raised Catholic. You've got 2,000 years of history there, right? And there's a great tradition when you become confirmed. I forgot the word for it for a while there, where it's the laying on of hands, which is a bad name, but basically like the bishop puts his hands on you, right? But it's an unbroken chain that goes back to Jesus. That's the story anyway, right?
Oh, okay.
Like the
Right.
bishop had that done to him by a bishop who had it done. So basically the idea is you've met the man who's met the man who's met the man who's met the man who met the man who met Jesus, right? This is great unbroken chain. And that's awesome, right? It's a bit of a fiction, but when you leave a faith, you lose that. And I think this is a common experience for everybody, right? Like deconverting is lonely. Being an organic intellectual where you figure it out for yourself in solitude is a very lonely experience. And if you look at the history of organizations, even if you belong to an organization, these organizations, it's broken, it's disconnected, it's disjointed. there isn't this continuity forever the way we have it in some of our churches. But what Chris pointed out, which is amazing, is there's a rich literary history, right? If you want to read the books that atheists wrote and atheists read, and it reinforced their atheism, it's there. It's there for us to get. The intellectual history, right? This connected legacy of like who influences who. It's there, and we get to wear the next link in the chain, and that's a great feeling. It's amazing that what Chris pointed out, like it's sure there are times when it's two very, very separate strains, right? Like absolutely makes perfect sense. The African American experience leads to Black atheism that is focused on anti-racism, but that it goes back to Robert Ingersoll and then it goes back to Thomas Paine. That's incredible. And that's like from where we are now, when we go back and we learn about Hubert Harrison. Oh, it's awesome. Harry Haywood. This is an amazing history I would not have discovered if we didn't talk to Chris. So I'm super thankful for that. And I mean, this is stuff that now I feel like it feels like there's a bigger community out there. Yeah. And also Chris points out, if you're a patron, you get the bonus material. Chris mentions some of the people who we can kick out of the pantheon,
right?
Yeah, which is another great thing. We all get to decide to do that. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
So yeah. I this part I really, really dig, and seeing it come together now, talking to different people about this, seeing what we hold in common, what's different, what's coming together, what fell off. I dig it. It's awesome. It's great.
Yeah.
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 What did you take away from this discussion?
Oh, just that there's so much interesting that, well, part of it is, I guess, if you want to explore more, it's in his book to check out. But I mean, there's just so much stuff that we could have talked more about. I mean, I was really fascinated about even the question of the religion of enslaved people, what they brought with them from Africa, and how that, obviously he was right to point out that, it's not as though there's sort of one kind of African religion or something that everyone whole shared. I mean, like, because it's, people were coming from different places along, mostly in West Africa, but not totally, different places. They're winding up in different places in the Americas, and they could be winding up with different kinds of Christianities and so on. So I mean, there's a ton of diversity there in the mix of all, like, how the religions they brought with them mix with the ones that were adhered to by the white people, I guess. So I think it's like, yeah, that was really interesting.
Yeah, that was shocking to me too. And I don't know who taught me, like, I don't know where I learned what I learned from, but it was very, very wrong. So it's great to hear a corrective
about, like, slave religion.
Yeah, slave religion. They didn't have they all converted to Christianity. It gave them comfort in their struggle. That's not true. Go figure.
Yes, yeah. Just that it's a lot more complicated than that.
Yeah.
And there were skeptics. I mean, some of it, like he mentioned, the question of like recovering it in like slave narratives and accounts from travelers. But obviously, I mean, it's such a good point that, if you're a slave like a former slave trying to build support for your cause, you're probably not going to say that you're an atheist or something like that. So yeah, so like it's such a fascinating thing, like trying to get at potential areas of doubt and disbelief, kind of like coming at it from like a side angle, like, looking at it through what a traveler's narrative through the South or something might happen to tell you. Yeah, I think it's really fascinating. Yeah.
Does it overlap much with your own work?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, my book was mostly focused on white atheist attitudes toward race. So I think like my book and his book kind of link up well together.
Ooh, that's good. You got to double them up in in Amazon. One of those clicks at the bottom where it's like people who bought this also bought that.
Yeah.
That's where it got to be.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But I think like, his point at the end, I guess I'm not sure what it was actually, but like, that for Black freethinkers, obviously anti-racism is really at the center of their worldview. And it's not, I mean, in my book, I found that there were definitely white freethinkers who were anti-racist and who opposed racism. There were some who did really champion that. But then, even for like Robert Ingersoll, he spoke out against racism, but I don't think, it wasn't like a central mission of his life or something like that. So I think, that's an important point as well. Yeah, I mean, I think the sort of the links and the opposite of links between the two, like white free thought and black free thought, where they intersected and where they didn't is also quite interesting.
Yeah. So buy both books, read both, see where they connect and where they disconnect.
Mm-hmm.
There we go.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it's great stuff. He's got a great project. He's got we'll link to the books below, and to Nathan's as well. We discussed this during the podcast. A lot of this was hiding in plain sight, and we just didn't notice that they were they're atheist thinkers.
Yeah, that's another good point too. That I think it's interesting. I mean, like, there's always this sort of idea about history, like, are we gonna like run out of like history to write about? And I think it's like we probably won't, because we're always sort of interested in phenomena that we're noticing in our own time, and then like going back to the past to look at it.
Right? How did we get here?
Yeah, and I mean, I think like in the past 2 decades or so, we've definitely seen an upsurge in the number of non-religious people. So I think, and there's been a corresponding scholarly interest, I think, in looking at that today and historically as well. So I think, that's another point.
Yeah. I'm curious as to what people think are like really important atheists in the history of atheism, because now we've got the Four Horsemen, where I think we're big for a lot of people. But I'm always surprised to see that Paine is such a big one. I mean, Ingersoll I had no knowledge of until starting the podcast. Paine I knew about. I didn't know he was that big. I think like Nietzsche and Marx and Feuerbach.
Yeah.
Right. I don't think this. I'd love to hear from other people what you guys think. Hit me up.
Yeah.
At Nath G. Alexander. If you have complaints, hit me up at Nath G. Alexander. Don't be afraid. Love responding to your complaints. And also, if you have good responses to someone praying for you, we'd love to hear more about that.
Right. Yeah. Yes.
Any other business we need to attend to, Nathan?
We've got to thank our patrons.
Absolutely.
Lars, Debbie, and the AHS Plus blog.
Fantastic.
Thank you so much.
Thank you guys so much, as always. And everybody else, thank you for listening. We love the audience. We wouldn't be here without you. It'd be pointless to do this without an audience. And we'd love to have you as patrons. You'd get access to a longer discussion, a little more information, gets a little gossipy, spill the tea a little bit. Oh, but if you can't do that, it's always good to just press the like button, like and subscribe. That's a big help. We always appreciate that. Also, big ups to Red Japan, killing it as always. All right, everybody. Until next time. Bye-bye.